Welcome to lecture number 95, historical topic 8.12, youth culture of the 1960s. The theme today is American and regional culture. There's one learning objective, and that is explain how and why opposition to existing policies and values developed and changed over the course of the 20th century. The first key concept begins with anti-war protests. Although anti-communist foreign policy faced little domestic opposition in previous years, the Vietnam War inspired sizable and passionate anti-war protests that became more numerous as the war escalated and sometimes led to violence. The key concept has done a little work for us in describing the change throughout the period. It brought up the previous era of the Red Scare and how people were reacting to the anti-communist policies of the United States, and compared it to the growing resistance in the later years of the period. The people doing most of the protesting was the baby boom generation. This shows a contrast between how the baby boom generation reacted to these foreign policies and the way that their parents before them reacted during the Red Scare. The baby boomers were a lot more vocal about what they perceived as unjust and were less likely to conform. There's various possible reasons for this. For one, they generally were better educated, having had more access to college education than the previous generation. They may have rejected the mass consumerism and conformity they were exposed to in their childhood. But probably the most practical explanation is that they were of the generation that were subject to the draft after graduating high school or college. As the Vietnam War escalated while they were in college, they were understandably anxious that when they graduated, they could potentially end up having to go and fight in this war. College student groups that led the way were the Students for the Democratic Society and the Free Speech Movement. SDS was founded in 1960 at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Port Huron Statement was their manifesto, and it laid the foundation for their new left. This was a new political liberal faction that had advocated for civil rights, environmentalism, feminism, and gay rights. They were different than the old left in that they were less concerned with economic or labor issues. The free speech movement was started at the University of California, Berkeley in 1964. They were influenced by the new left and mobilized to protest university policies that dissuaded political speech on campus and forced faculty to sign loyalty pledges. War protests included sit-ins and marches in which young men burnt their draft card. The Supreme Court later ruled that laws that made this illegal were constitutional because they were technically burning federal property. In the first half of 1968 alone, there were more than 200 protests across the country with more than 40,000 participants. Because of the size of these protests, the National Guard would sometimes be called in. In the case of the 1907 protest at Kent State in Ohio, this turned violent and deadly for some of the students, when the National Guard began to fire on the unarmed student crowds. The next key concept says, some groups on the left also rejected liberal policies, arguing that political leaders did too little to transform the racial and economic status quo at home and pursued immoral policies abroad. In the 1968 Democratic National Convention, the party had to choose a nominee out of a difficult set of circumstances. The sitting president had dropped out of the race in March over unpopularity over the Vietnam War. The candidate that had the greatest lead in the primaries, Robert Kennedy, had been assassinated in June of that year. Eugene McCarthy was the remaining candidate who partook in the primaries. He was favored by the younger party members for his anti-war stance. This young anti-war faction called themselves the Yippies, who were formerly the Youth International Party. They waited outside the convention center in Chicago awaiting the nomination of their preferred candidate. However, after several rounds of voting by delegates at the convention, the candidacy was awarded to the sitting vice president, Hubert Humphrey, who had not participated in any of the primaries. When the news reached the people outside of the convention, riots and violence broke out between protesters and the police who were trying to subdue the riot. The Weather Underground was a splinter group from the Students for a Democratic Society formed in 1969. They turned to violence because they lost patience with the movement and their peaceful tactics. In their manifesto, they claimed our intention is to disrupt the empire, to incapacitate it, to put pressure on the cracks. They used bombings as a technique to advance their view. One of the most visible bombings was when they sneaked into the Pentagon and detonated a bomb from the bathroom in the Air Force Wing. Their logo is shown on the screen. It's a rainbow with a zigzagging arrow going through it. The violence turned off a lot of Americans from these liberal movements. The extremism hurt the larger cause and led to the conservative backlash in the 1968 election of Richard Nixon. Nixon campaigned on a law and order platform that targeted extremist violence and race riots of the late 1960s. The last key concept says young people who participated in the counterculture of the 1960s rejected many of the social, economic, and political values of their parents' generation, introduced greater informality into the U.S. culture, and advocated changes in sexual norms. The pictures on the screen give a sense of what the greater informality looked like. Just based on the dress and attire alone, this generation looked vastly different than the mainstream, or even different than the previous counterculture movements before them. The members of this counterculture movement are called hippies. They wore their hair long, and some had unkempt facial hair, wore long beaded jewelry, and a great diversity in their clothing. They listened to folk and rock music. Examples of these are Bob Dylan and Joan Baez as famous folk heroes. They performed at the 1963 Civil Rights March on Washington since the subject matter of their songs was the times aligned with their struggle. The annual Newport Folk Festival started in 1959, and that was another place where more of these folk hippies could be found. Rock icons of the era include Jimi Hendrix and the Jimi Hendrix Experience, seen in the bottom right, and Janis Joplin on the bottom left. Their style of music was influenced by jazz and blues, but also took on experimental and interpretive methods. That's definitely the case for the rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner that Jimi Hendrix played at the Woodstock Music Festival in 1969. The melody of the anthem was frequently interrupted by distorted guitar strums that sounded like bombs and high-frequency wails that sounded like screams. Premarital sex, marital infidelity, and homosexuality are shown to be more prevalent than people had previously thought in this period. It was uncovered by a researcher named Alfred Kinsey in his studies on sex. It wasn't that the 1960s brought about a sexual revolution, it's just that it became more visual. Finally, here's the recap. Baby boomers in college began to join movements opposing the Vietnam War. Some offshoot groups turned to violence and stressed drug use. It led to a backlash against their larger causes. Hippies and flower children made up the counterculture, and at this point you've encountered various different countercultures. In the 1920s, the Lost Generation, in the 1950s it was the Beats, and now the hippies in the 1960s.
Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click the video link on the screen. And if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back in the next lecture.